listening to the Security VIP Podcast, hosted by Taylor May, the official podcast of the security industry and home of nothing but the truth.
What's going on, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Security VIP Podcast, the official podcast of the security industry and home of nothing but the truth. As always, I'm your host, Taylor May. And on today's episode, we are featuring a company that can not only improve your GSOC, but provide you with the right tools that protect your people, brand, and assets from any potential risk that may arise. As a company that was founded in 2018 from the beautiful state of California, it is my pleasure to welcome and introduce the founder and CEO of RAS Watch, Mr. Ryan Schonfeld, to the Security VIP Podcast today. Ryan, how are we doing today, brother?
Good, Taylor. How are you? Thank you for having me.
Doing great, man. And you know what this podcast is about. It's not about nothing but the truth. But before we talk about RAS and what you guys specialize in, let's talk about Ryan for a second, man. Share your background, your industry experience with us.
Sure. Yeah, I guess I'm a bit of a rebel in the space. I don't like to conform to norms, or the worst thing that people could say to me is that's the way that it's always been done. And that's really kind of driven my career from the beginning, which started in law enforcement. I was a police officer and detective, and kind of a rebel police officer when I went and got my master's in IT. And everybody was like, well, what the hell is a police officer doing pursuing an IT degree? But from then kind of got involved in computer crimes, computer forensics. And that was really the beginning of what's driven my entire career to date, which is finding ways to leverage tech to enable antiquated spaces. And in my opinion, law enforcement and the physical security industry are two of probably the most antiquated industries on the planet. However, they're some of the most important ones. And so my passion for what those industries provide to the people that they serve, to tech enable them and help bring them forward into the future has just been so important. Actually, while I was in law enforcement, I was brought on by the U.S. State Department to go train some foreign allied governments on how to collect and seize digital evidence and use them to put bad people away. Transitioned over to the private sector, worked for Securitas, managed a book of business for them. It was an interesting time, the beginning of Obamacare, and guard companies were looking for ways to leverage tech to reduce human capital and reduce ultimately healthcare costs. Moved from Securitas in-house, managed global investigations for Fox Entertainment, and then I ran their global security and safety technology group before leaving to begin what I describe as my entrepreneurial journey. So we had a consulting practice, RAS Consulting, and really worked with organizations to conceptualize, design, implement, and run security programs. And the premise of RAS Consulting was really looking at culture-centric companies. And one of the problems I had in the entertainment world, looking at consultants and physical security service providers, was there was the way that it's always been done, right? And we were a company where culture and the feel of everything was very important to entertainment folks and executives, celebrities. And it was so important that we be able to leverage best practices in security, but not try to change the company to meet those best practices. And that's really the premise behind, I think, the foundation of and the success of our consulting practice is focusing on the company and their culture and what's important to them, and making security fit the organization rather than trying to make organizations change themselves to fit an antiquated mold of what security is supposed to be.
100%. And a lot of good points there, Ryan, that you brought up. But first, you brought up, you have a law enforcement background, LEA background. You work for Securitas, and Greg Abbott over there is a good friend of mine over there at Securitas. Great guy
I worked
to
with
know.
Greg.
Greg's one of my closest buddies over there. So guys, Securitas huge in our space. You mentioned physical security, and now you have all this expertise and knowledge and background you're taking it to RAS. So talk about RAS now. RAS Watch. What's the company about? What is y'all specialty? where's the company going? Let's talk about it for a second.
Yeah, so RAS Watch really formed out of our consulting practice. We found, I mentioned our culture forward companies that we like to work with, and a lot of those are venture-backed tech companies, fast-moving. And one of the things we found working with those organizations is that the security department there doesn't move as quickly as the rest of the company, or they may not have dedicated people for physical security. In most cases, they're not building GSOCS or the functional components of a security program that you would see in a more traditional company of their size. And that's really one of the things that led to the formation of RAS Watches. When we went to all of these companies and said, hey, are you going to do the GSOC? Are you going to do the travel program? You're going to monitor Intel? It's not a core competency of the business. It doesn't drive their growth or their bottom line. And when you're venture backed, your investors really want to see large capital expenses going towards those things and not cost centers like security.
Right.
And so the concept of, well, what if there was a fully baked Fortune 100 level security program, what you would expect to see if you went into a Fortune 100 company that you could just subscribe to as a white labeled service, no major capital to participate. And you would get the basics of cameras and access control support, but also mass communications and intel and travel tracking, social media monitoring, executive protection support, all of those more advanced functions that, when people say GSOC or SOC, and really when you go look at it, it's like some guards sitting in a room watching the cameras. We're talking true GSOC functionality as a service, and that's the premise behind RAS Watch. We're really kind of a first of its kind. It's subscription based. One of the only GSOCs I've ever been in where there's not one server. We leverage hosted and solutions. We're cloud based. It was awesome during COVID in terms of distributing workforce and letting some people go remote. So it's a pretty new approach to leveraging old ideas.
Ryan, is it safe to say, because I've had this argument before a couple of times on my podcast, is it safe to assume or say that cloud is going to be the industry standard in the next 5-10 years? Or what are you seeing? Or you think on-prem is still going to be a relevance, or what are you seeing right now?
I think that cloud is the way that most organizations were moving pre-COVID. I think COVID has really sped up that process for a lot of companies, the idea of corporate digital transformation. But now that, organizations are decentralizing more, one of the things they realized when their workforce all of a sudden had to distribute was this old infrastructure setup that they had really wasn't supportive of where their business had evolved over the past 10, 15, 30 years. And so what we're seeing is companies push even harder and faster to the cloud. Now, of course, there's outliers and, companies that can't do it or won't do it, or there's compliance reasons behind it. But generally speaking, anybody who's not at least looking at it is well behind the curve.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's definitely going to come on the rise. And I agree to your point that COVID has definitely sped that process up. I spoke with Tom Cook at Hanwha. He said the same thing. Prior to COVID-19, it was slowly getting there, but now COVID-19 has definitely pushed it over the hurdle. So a good point there, Ryan. And you mentioned GSOC, and man, I've seen a lot of GSOCs in my time here in the industry, and some of these GSOCs, man, just to your point, it's a guard sticking in an office, but really it's like a closet environment, and
Yep.
it's not your typical, I guess what you would want to have in a GSOC. So talk about the biggest challenge you guys see at RAS when it comes to these GSOCs here in the industry. What's the biggest challenge that you guys see, and how are you guys solving the challenge?
Ooh, there's a lot of them. So I think, most organizations, the way they grow, whether it's through whether they're a venture-backed company, it's a more established traditional company that's acquired other businesses. The reality of infrastructure through most businesses is, they don't have a standardized access platform across all of their facilities. They don't have standardized VMS. They have disparate hardware solutions. In some cases, they have multiple security teams within the organization doing different things. And so one of the problems because of disparate platforms is the idea of integration. Another problem is the idea of noise. Think access control door forced alarms. I mean, there's companies that get millions of door forced alarms a year through their operations center. In fact, we talked to one recently that said they get 5.4 million door forced alerts per year into their GSOC just for one segment of their corporate facilities. So I was having a discussion with the guy, and he was like, how many of those 5.4 million do you think were actual valid security events? And I thought I was being kind of a dick when I said 3, but the real answer was 1. And so 5.4 million to 1 is an absolutely atrocious ratio.
Right.
And think about the number of heads that have to be in the operations center on a day-to-day basis to parse through those events to figure out that actually nothing really happened.
So
and
much
so that
garbage
noise
to
problem,
filter through,
it's
man. That's just
garbage.
so much garbage to filter. That's incredible.
Well, and the end result is you get these operators in the environment with this leatherized skin where these alerts become noise and they become complacent to them because you've got, do the number in my 4 million minus 1. Every one of those has been a garbage alert. And all of a sudden that one comes in. The likelihood of the operator missing that one important one is so high because of all of the noise and the false alerts that the whole system is almost useless. And so that's a huge problem that needs to be solved for operation centers. And access control is only one of the systems that's driving that noise. Now insert video, insert social media monitoring, insert all of those different advanced functions, and that noise becomes so overwhelming. And the only way to scale those programs effectively today is by throwing more and more bodies at it, which is just, it's not scalable. It doesn't do a good job of passing key information from one segment to the other. And you end up with somebody in charge of access control and somebody in charge of this system. But to have this multi-million-dollar operations center that's supposed to drive operational effectiveness or impactful intelligence, if those system outputs aren't being properly correlated with one another, what's the benefit? Why are you doing it at all?
100%. And just for our listeners and followers, I'm not saying the human element is ever going to go away, but it's definitely slowed down, putting more bodies on the ground. We talk about access control, AI, analytics, VMS, social media monitoring, what Ryan just mentioned. I mean, there's so many key, parts in this puzzle that I think tend to get overlooked. And man, I just to your point, man, I can't imagine getting 5.1 or 5.4 million events, but only one event of the 5.5 million events was actually a security event. Like, what the hell is going on? How do we segregate that data? So I think that's what you guys are doing now at RAS, right? You guys are helping filter that data, help filter those events and those actions, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, Ryan.
Yeah, so we've spent the last year feeding a lot of that data from end users into our environment and parsing it out. And to your point, we're not a company that says get rid of people. There's always going to be a need for people in security. You can't automate everything. However, that noise that we were talking about, there is a lot of automation that can be done on that front. And one of the things that we've seen over the last year of measuring all of these inputs from different manufacturers and systems and end user types and verticals is that about 90 to 92% of the alerts and the data that flow into an operations center on a day-to-day basis could be automated, whether it's anomaly detection and noise reduction, or things that there's less than 10% of those alerts that truly require an operator or a human to make a decision and action. And so the operations center of the future really focuses on that 8 to 10%, and everything else is automated. And while you still need people for that 8 to 10%, instead of a 5-person shift, maybe it's a 2-person shift or a 1-person shift. And that's really what RAS Watch is working towards. And some exciting announcements to come in terms of ways that we're actually going to build and solve that problem. But that's where we're headed.
It's very reassuring to hear that because, my conversations with end users like Cherokee Nation and MGM Grand in Vegas, these
Mhm.
guys don't want to have 8 different GUIs to look at or 8 different systems to log in. They want to have one centralized GUI, but not every single GUI needs to be that complex that, all these pieces are in that GUI. So, what you guys are doing there, I love to hear that, Ryan. It's good to know. And also, let's talk about AI and machine learning for a second. I'm going to skip a question here on my podcast because I think AI and machine learning is definitely on the rise. It's a hot commodity now in our industry. And just kind of per your website, I'm going to quote, RAS Watch can detect anomalies and fluctuations in cameras, recordings, drive free space, access control panels, etc. Talk about this further to our viewers today and kind of what you guys are doing around AI, machine learning, and maybe, pick a piece of AI that you guys kind of rely on the most. Let's hear it.
Yeah. So AI and machine learning, what a funny term, or funny terms. If you think back to when people started selling analytic products into the security space, and it was this sort of buzzword catch-all term that analytics are going to solve everybody's problem. But what is an analytic, and how does it actually work? What is AI? What is machine learning? And it's a funny conversation we have with end users all the time. We'll get a generic email from somebody that says, "Oh yeah, we want to use AI to solve that problem." Um, okay, well, what is the problem? The user hasn't actually defined the problem that they want to solve, but maybe they read an article about the advances in AI, or what machine learning can do. And so it's, how do we take this? The technology is good, like machine learning has come a very long way. I think, and I will talk about some of the products, but I think one of the challenges, and I like to lead with this whenever we get into conversations about AI and ML, is our industry does an extraordinarily poor job of educating the end user, not about what the product can do, but what the product can't do. And it's so important to make sure that, especially in security, when decision making not often but can actually be life and death, that the end user has the correct expectations around where the system's capabilities stop or where it's not good, because that's the part where the human element comes in, or where you need to make sure that the program is picking up where the system leaves off. In terms of some of the products, I generally don't like to talk about specific manufacturers, but in terms of what the products do for us, noise reduction is a big one. So think about like video motion alerts, for example. Think about all the things that within a camera's field of view can cause a motion event, whether it's a um, dust reflecting back off the IR at night, or a spider crawling across a lens, or leaves blowing in the wind. Those things, particularly at scale, can create this massive influx of noise in an operations center, um, because it's motion. The
Right.
camera is not that smart to know the difference between a person or a vehicle in most cases. Some of them are starting to get these built out in the cameras at the edge, but for the most part, it's either an edge server or a hosted solution that's doing that type of analysis, quieting the noise, and then just pushing the valid alarms through. Um, Another example is a product that looks at anomalous pixel changes within the field of view. And I like that one because a lot of the systems are based on system training, right? You load a huge number of videos into the system and it starts training for what is a fight scene, what is
Yep.
a fire, what is a, whatever it is. And its base of knowledge is solely what you've ingested, and it gets to compare against. And so I think it's a novel approach to say the system actually doesn't know what the event type is, but it does know that the change in pixels within that field of view over a constantly learning period is anomalous for that particular camera. And then that's where the human piece comes in to say, okay, that's a fight. Okay, it's a car going the wrong way or it's somebody hopping a fence.
There's still that judgment call, because even if you feed a neural net all these images of, this is a chair, this is not a chair, yada yada yada. There's once that event pops up, the human element still has to make that judgment call, say, yeah, you know what, that is a chair, it's red, whatever, right? So here's my question to our AI too, because I work for an AI manufacturer. Have you seen the benefit of using synthetic data at all when you pour feeds into a neural net, or you still think like, it's better just to have real world scenario, use existing cameras when you can? But do you think synthetic data has a crucial play into kind of building out a specialized neural net?
I think it has a play in terms of the volume of data that's required to train a system. The problem with synthetic data is it's just that, right? And oftentimes it doesn't do a great job of mimicking real world. And we hear in the news a lot today about like AI bias. And I think that synthetic data is probably one of the problems in that regard, in that the systems now are trained based on quasi or non-real world events. I mean, the synthetic data is built from something, but it's still only partially real. So I think the challenge is, how do you build a system without it may not be possible because of the volume of data that's required to build it. But with the right hybrid of it, I'm probably not smart enough to really answer that question, but that's kind of where my knowledge ends.
No, because I agree with synthetic data, man. I think it's a hybrid approach to it. Just because, I started this podcast because I see so much vaporware in our industry, and I want to eliminate that. And I've seen issues with COVID-19 related solutions that come out and just haven't panned out. And even on the AI sector, these AI companies come out and they just pull feeds off Google. They Google image, guns, for example. They'd say, oh yeah, we're going to get all these images of guns, we're going to feed into a neural net, it's going to be the best weapon detection system on the market. You put it out in the real world, it picks up everything that's a gun, a phone, a remote control, a stick. So this is what I'm talking about. There's got to be that fine balance when we talk about AI in general.
Just look at the cloud real quick, though. We'll go way back in terms of vaporware and people not understanding what they're talking about. People are so quick to say, hey, we're going to the cloud, or let's put that in the cloud. And I don't think there's a good general understanding out there yet in our space of what the cloud really means. I mean, it's not this magical, mythical place in the sky, right? It's still servers living somewhere. It's someone else's servers,
right?
And so, what that means for an organization to deploy, and we were talking to a company the other day. They have 2,500 surveillance cameras, and they said, well, we want to go to the cloud. And I'm like, okay, well, how many cameras are at each site, and if they're HD, and what's your bandwidth considerations for each of the sites? And rather than having thought through, and that's part of our role, is to help people think through that. But it's just this idea that I think it's the trade show thing, right? Like, I know there's really no trade shows this year, but in general, people go to the trade show and they see all of these products working in this sort of idealized, perfect environment on the show floor. And they think that it's just going to neatly translate back to their environments. But the reality is everybody's got different infrastructure, different bandwidth, different capabilities, and it's just never that clean.
Yep. What's your recommendation, Ryan? Because I know I'm itching to go back to a trade show. Hopefully 2021 will do us kindly. But what's your recommendation to manufacturers to not promote, a snake oil sales guy or a vaporware approach, or how to make that transition more seamless to a real world environment for a customer?
So I take a different approach, and there's a lot of manufacturers who don't like me, and I'm okay with that. Or maybe I should say that they don't like my approach less than me, hopefully, because I think I'm an okay person. But I'm very much no bullshit approach to talking about the product. And the first thing that I have them put on display for any of our customers that we're talking to, going back to an earlier statement, is what doesn't it do? What doesn't it do well? Because everybody's so quick to show off all of the great things about the product. I want people to see the great things that your product does once they have the context of what it doesn't do well. So that they're seeing all of those great things with that in their back of the head, saying, okay, that's really cool that it does that. I'm thinking through my current deployment. What do I have or what do I need to get to supplement this so that it works in an ideal state? That's how we want end users to approach things. And I don't think that I think manufacturers a lot of times are scared to have that conversation because they think it will hamper the sale of
Yep.
the product. But in fact, I think it builds more trust
100%.
with the end user. And I think it makes it much more of a consultative sale where people will be willing to pull the trigger because I think in the end, it will shorten your sales cycle if you have those conversations early.
You have to identify the flaws of your product, as great as it may be. There's always some kind of flaw to your product that can be shown or exposed. And I hate to say it, but a lot of manufacturers are scared to say that, or they won't say it just because they want to get that sale. They want to get that quick dollar. But I think if we're upfront and honest with customers of hey, I've got this awesome product, it does this, but it lacks in this area, might be a concern for you in that approach. But also something too, Ryan. I said this earlier on LinkedIn about my podcast. Is I promoted this earlier. I said, manufacturers do not hold any power in this industry. The end users do. So here as a manufacturer, we can come up with the best product in the world. We think it's going to work for everyone's environment, but I bring it to a client and they say, Taylor, what the hell is this? This is not going to work. That's why we need to have this education moment for manufacturers. Say, listen, this client wants this. This is not going to work for his environment. We need to reorganize, re-strategize our approach here on the manufacturing side. So I definitely appreciate that, and I definitely respect that because I think we need to have this education moment more when it comes to these trade shows and making sure we're getting our messaging right and setting expectations right too. So definitely appreciate that. But let's talk about RAS, Ryan. I want to highlight more on you guys, man. Talk about verticals, brother. What verticals are you guys seeing the most traction in right now?
Yeah, still a lot of tech and venture-backed companies. We do a lot of work in the entertainment space, starting to get some traction in education. We're very focused on the private sector as a business. I'm sure there's a day where we start expanding into government opportunities, but for right now, um, those are our main market segments. We're starting to do a little bit of stuff with gaming, which is
Interesting.
interesting. But they're so highly regulated that we'll see where all of that goes in terms of being able to send things off site versus everything having to reside on site at the location. Um, but we're seeing, with this is really a COVID thing. More companies starting to outsource their GSOC or looking for a failover GSOC. Because the business continuity and resiliency portion of programs was really brought to light during COVID. And so we're getting a lot of engagement now on that front, whether they're closing the facility that the GSOC is in, or they just realized that like if there was a fire in their facility, if there was a COVID outbreak, that their GSOC program would be done. There's nowhere to go. And so that's brought a lot of people to the table this year as well.
Speaking of COVID, it's obviously the elephant in our everyday lives now, man. What are you guys doing at RES since COVID-19? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, we've been working really closely, and I put my consulting hat on a little bit, but with organizations, early on in COVID, it was helping companies figure out how to just get everybody out of the office, and then keep those offices protected. This whole having facilities with nobody in them for weeks or months on end is a new challenge for almost every company. Um, and the initial inclination for a bunch of companies was, well, let's just go out and hire guards. But hiring guards is an extraordinarily expensive proposition, particularly in a time where companies are facing such financial hardship.
Right.
And so early stage was, okay, there's always a place for guards, but let's figure out how to tech enable this solution. So we optimize whatever spend you have on people, but let's leverage our operations center and technology so that we can streamline that deployment. And then quickly it started transitioning to, okay, what does going back to work look like? Whether it was, new access control solutions that, your open paths and stuff and touchless systems and contactless destination dispatch for elevators. For a minute, the temperature screening was a hot topic. Still in and out. But really just sort of big picture of data, some interesting data that companies are really using a lot now is space utilization and occupancy,
Right.
for contact tracing, but also compliance reasons. Um, Contact tracing is a huge one. And unfortunately, we're still seeing a lot of companies attempting that process manually. We know over time, as the companies start bringing more and more of their population back to the office, that manual process just doesn't scale. And so we've been really heavily pushing companies to start considering technology options to streamline and expedite that process. And I think the challenge with adoption there has been, um, it's expensive. And so companies are hesitant to spend money on a problem that they view as temporary. And most of this tech will help them even after COVID's gone. It's not like it's a waste of money.
Right.
But what they don't realize is their spend on guards and having their entire health and safety team and security departments fully dedicated to contact tracing and these other functions, it's costing them several times over what one of these their ROI would be 30 to 60 days tops, which any CFO would take any day of the week. But it's just they're having a hard time pulling the trigger on it, and I think a lot of it has to do with companies not knowing really what date they're going to end up reopening and bringing people back. It was September originally, and then the September companies pushed to January. We're already seeing some of the January companies push to June. So it's just too much unknown.
Ryan, do you feel like end users are hesitant? You mentioned hesitant, but do you feel like they're also resistant to change and need kind of the new technology out there? What are you seeing?
I think it's a combination of things. There was a lot of change very quickly. Into your earlier point about snake oil, I think a lot of companies were burned really early when they
Right.
jumped on some technology bandwagons that didn't pan out. I know several that were impacted by that. And I can think of a few, and I never want to have an "I told you so" moment with a client, but there's several where we were like, "Don't buy that."
Got to live through pain, man. They got to live through pain sometimes.
Yeah, so there's a lot of expensive stuff that's in the trash now. But I think that's an element of, there's such information overload that these folks are getting hit up every day by salespeople selling them all kinds of stuff.
Right.
And it's such a new problem. Nobody knows, who's telling the truth, whose stuff really works, what do we really need.
Well, that's why you
And
got SecurityVIP, man. We tell nothing but the truth here. We got guys like Ryan, right? We're filtering this bullshit. Come on now.
there's a lot more filtering that needs to be done, but
100%.
absolutely.
100%.
So I think people have realized through all of this that change is essential. So early on, I would say that they were probably resistant to change. I think most people at this point have accepted that they can't resist it. And so now the question is, what are the right solutions to get past it?
Good point. I definitely agree with that aspect there. I think change is always can be difficult, but it's necessary, especially when you experience things like a pandemic like COVID-19. So you mentioned access control systems. I like the access question a lot. Open systems versus proprietary systems. Same concept can be applied to a VMS, a video management system. Which option do you prefer, Ryan, in the industry, open or proprietary, and why?
Well, historically, I've been a hardcore open all the way, no question guy. Because I think for an end user that's making a significant investment in the product, number one, it allows them to hedge their bet a little bit. If they end up not liking the product, if the company goes under, whatever it is, they don't have to do this massive capital re-expenditure and redo the project. However, there are some products of late that leverage more proprietary hardware out of necessity, because the standard and open products in the space don't support some of the new tech that they're bringing to the market. And that's a hard one to overlook, because you want to tell people to have the latest tech. And if the open solutions don't support it, then it's hard to tell them they need to stick with open. because
Right.
it's basically me saying, okay, you got to stick with old.
Yeah, I've never heard that before. It's an interesting conversation because Matt Barnett's a huge friend of mine over at
Hmm.
HID, Mercury
Love Matt.
Security. Matt's
Yep.
a great guy, man. Love that guy. And he'll tell you the same thing. Even when, Honeywell, interesting thing about Honeywell, Honeywell's majority proprietary, but now they're actually incorporating an open ecosystem into the Mercury backbone. And I think that's a good point you bring up because, we can have the best technology, the cutting edge technology. And if it's only run on a proprietary system and it's not open, eco-friendly, then we need to have that conversation with the open guys too. But I'm a big advocate of open ecosystems. I do agree with your point though. When it comes to new tech, sometimes that new tech can take a while to get into that kind of open platform environment.
I think there's also a hybrid today that we haven't historically seen. When you look at old school access control systems, for example, the availability of APIs to do simple integrations with different platforms. If that had been an option years ago, the notion of open hardware would have been a lot less important. And so you've got companies now that may have proprietary hardware components to their product, but because they have open APIs, the ability to scale it and use it with other manufacturers' products makes it a much more viable option. I think, closed and or proprietary and no APIs, I got heartburn with that.
I agree, man, and I've run through my fair share of manufacturers that have that same approach, and I'm not going to call them out. I've called out a couple manufacturers in the past, but we'll keep it friendly today on this episode. And
Thanks for not making me do it.
So what's next, man? What is next? And you guys are still new here in the industry, but maybe the next couple months, or maybe a 12-month plan, 24-month plan. What's next for the company at RAS?
Yeah, so we've got some big announcements coming in the next 30 to 60 days. But RAS is really taking on the problem of noise and making sense of data in an operations center environment. And so what's next for us is we're gonna build a product to help solve that problem for the industry, and we're
Love
going
to
to make
hear
it
that.
available to the industry, not just for us.
Love to hear that. I love to see that evolution coming. I think it's very needed. And my last and final question here, Ryan, is a question that I ask all the time. Here is my recap question. You pretty much hinted on, why RAS this whole episode. But if you had to put it into a 60-second pitch, 60-second hot seat is what I called this segment. Why RAS, competitive advantages. Why and should an end user choose you guys? Let's hear it.
Yeah. Well, from a GSOC perspective, we're really the only provider out there that can offer you a full Fortune level experience, white labeled. So to your employees, it feels like your in-house solution that's fully baked, no major capital, subscription-based service. But I think really, we are the player for the companies that want to be forward-looking and solve these problems, because we're looking at the problems that exist today in an operations center environment, and rather than building patchwork solutions to solve it, we're putting together comprehensive solutions to address the problem for us and our customers, but again for the industry as a whole, and that's really important to us, and I think still a differentiator in the space.
Dropping the mic on me, Ryan. I appreciate that, man. I always love these pitches, man. They always highlight kind of the full glimpse of the company. So, Ryan, if people want to hear more about the company, what's the contact information, website, email, phone number? Let's hear it.
Yep, raswatch.com, or check me out on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to connect, network, chat, do whatever.
Awesome. Well, appreciate it, Ryan. And for those that have questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to email me at info@securityvip.net. Once again, that's info@securityvip.net. Make sure to follow us on LinkedIn to see all the recent announcements about our VIP guests. Watch this episode of Ryan and I on YouTube, so subscribe to our YouTube channel. And when you're on the road, make sure to listen in on Spotify.com to listen to Ryan and I on this episode. Thank you again, Ryan, for the time. We'll catch you guys on the next one.